So I'm very happy to be speaking to Fiona Aubrey-Smith today. Fiona is the co-author of From EdTech to PedTech. She coined the term PedTech, and she is an associate lecturer and researcher at the Open University and runs many consulting jobs in EdTech and the education field, both in impact evaluations as well as broader consulting projects for academy trusts, multi-academy trusts, and edtech companies, schooling institutions of various kinds. And I'm very happy to be speaking to her today because I believe her job and her work in edtech, especially in linking pedagogical practices to edtech tools, is a very valuable contribution to the field. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's great to be here.
So, to kind of get the ball rolling, I think the very first question, and I guess this is kind of starting it easy, quote unquote, is what is effective pedagogy?
That's a great question. And I guess if you asked 100 different people, you'd probably get 100 different answers to that. And maybe that's the point. I think effectiveness is very closely tied to what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it and how we're going about doing that, and the context that those actions sit within. So effectiveness is all very context specific. So then when we think about effective pedagogy, we're thinking about the context we're working in, but also what kind of pedagogy? Are we talking about different styles of teaching and learning? Are we talking about system or organizational structures? Are we talking about the formation of knowledge and how that comes to exist? There's lots and lots of ideas wrapped up in this word pedagogy. What does pedagogy even mean? Would be so different to so many different people. So yeah, it's a very vague answer, but it's a very great question.
And we can delve deeper into this because this is being discussed a lot in EdTech right now. Effective EdTech, evidence-based EdTech, and I myself ran 3 or 4 interviews before today on the topic. And I think several times I would have liked to step back and say, okay, but let's try to kind of define this. And I felt it wasn't really simple to do this, but you did this really well in your book. And I think it's a great chance right now to kind of bring in a little bit of the theory, as you did in From EdTech to PedTech, and link this to what is happening in the EdTech world. So why is it that 2 people might have a different belief of what effective pedagogy is, and how, maybe if we want to exemplify it, like with a contradictory scenario in which maybe even the one person might think of enacting something that might seem effective, some pedagogical practice or method that might be effective in a certain pedagogical theory, but might be enacting it in a way that is not really aligned, right? I think this is kind of one of the points that comes out in your book. So can you help us kind of navigate this?
Unpack that. Sure. Well, I mean, the thing is when we think about what we're trying to achieve within the education space, as we sort of touched on a moment ago, all of us have just slightly different ideas about what that might look like in practice. And when we think about EdTech, historically, the focus has been on using different kinds of digital technology tools within the context of education, of schools, of classrooms. And the pivot, the focal point has been very much around incorporating, implementing, utilizing the technology in the classroom. So that pivot point's been very much about the technology. But actually what that does is it focuses us on kind of shoehorning something into a context and then making it fit the context. And sometimes it's a bit like trying to fit a 1 litre container of water into a ½ litre pot. You know, it may or may not fit. It might be the best thing that's ever happened, but equally it might not, or it might have other kinds of unintended consequences, unintended side effects. So by pivoting this around the other way and thinking, what do we want that educational practice to be? What do we want that pedagogy to be? What do we even mean by education, schooling, teaching, learning, knowledge? What do these ideas mean? Then we can become much more precise, much clearer on our purpose, our intentions, and then we can choose and use the relevant tools, digital or non-digital, to align with that and to help us to kind of be the best version of what that is. And that's this notion of pedagogical alignment. And I'll give you a really, really simple example. It's not actually a digital one at all that illustrates this beautifully. So lots of educators will stand at the classroom door and greet their students as they arrive. It's quite a common thing in all sorts of different contexts. And if you watch what happens really carefully, the same action, teacher saying, you know, hello, Luigi, hello, Fiona, at the classroom door, looks the same practice. Yeah, the teacher's just greeting the students. If you watch carefully, there's several different things that can happen. You can have a teacher that's saying, hello, Luigi, welcome to the classroom. And what the inference there is, I'm the educator, this is my classroom, I'm in charge, you're coming in, you will do as I say, and I will dictate what you're going to do and learn today. You can have another teacher who does that another way around. Hello, Luigi, come in. This is our learning community. We're going to share this today. You belong here. I'm here to support you in your needs. Same action, two very, very different intentions. And the two different intentions will then create two different sets of behaviors, two different sets of expectations, two different types of talk and dialogue, two different ways of questions and answers happening. You know, the actual implications after that can be totally, totally different. And that's why looking beyond that surface is so critically important. Now, that example, all that is was someone saying hello at a classroom door. So you layer in something as sophisticated as digital technology into that, and imagine how diverse the different utilizations can therefore be, is potentially massive. So if we're not clear on not just what we're doing and how we're doing it, but why we're doing it, if we don't have that clarity, the gap is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so this so-called digital divide is not just then about connectivity, devices, infrastructure. Actually, then it becomes the divide in different approaches and ways of being within a learning environment. So it's fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating.
Yeah. So there's two directions to take this in, or actually probably many more. One is whether I wonder when running an impact evaluation before running either an RCT or pre-post tests or whatever evaluation methodology, we should first perhaps run an alignment test to whether to understand whether the EdTech tools are being utilized with the intent that perhaps there's this contains a lot of areas, but the intent with which whoever initially gave this direction, if we're talking about pedagogical politics, I guess, whoever gave the intention was intentioned to, but then are they applied in such a way, and if they are not, if there's pedagogical misalignment, then how could we expect an RCT to demonstrate any significant difference in learning, for example? I guess, can you navigate this aspect of impact evaluations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because RCTs and those kinds of approaches to impact and efficacy, we kind of, in the education space, we kind of borrowed those from the scientific world. And what's really fascinating is that in the scientific world, let's take the medical profession, we have these sort of large scale studies and efficacy studies to see if something works, maybe a new medicine. And that gives us confidence that that medicine works for that particular medical problem, that diagnosis, that particular patient type, etc., etc. But the thing that the medical profession does that we're really not very good at yet in education is it will talk about the efficacy of something, but it will also talk about the side effects of that intervention. You know, 1 in 10 people might get headaches, 1 in 100 people, might feel nauseous, 1 in 1,000 people might unfortunately die as a consequence of taking that medicine. We don't really talk about that with education research or EdTech research. And I think that, and Professor Young Zhao talks about this in his brilliant book, Why What Works Might Hurt. And it's a really important point that we need to draw out of. It's important to look at efficacy based on the thing itself, the tool, the intervention, whatever. But it's more important to think about that human being holistically. What will they benefit from if they engage with this? And also, what are the risks? And what are the potential side effects? And what are the contraindications? How does this work with other things that are going on? And some of those can be quite tricky to measure. So we can measure, it's a bit like an iceberg. We can measure the bits at the top, can't we? Attainment, progress, attendance as a proxy for learning is often used, behavioral issues. We can measure all those sorts of things. But then when we look at what's underneath all of that, the human, the student, the learner experience, things like a feeling of dignity in the moment of learning when someone gets stuck. Have I still got my dignity even when I'm finding something hard? Or do I feel confident to try a new activity? Those sorts of things are much more complex to measure. And actually, the more rewarding thing to do from an academic research perspective is actually to look at really richly describing those things, really unpicking and unpacking them instead, to see those kinds of sequential causal effects between different things that are happening in the classroom environment. So much more of a stepping stone sequence across a river rather than, one great big bridge, the Rialto Bridge, from one side of the river to another.
Do you think longitudinal studies, albeit, of course, having the constraint of time, meaning that they come much later on, are kind of a partial solution to this problem of being able to study the side effects as well as the easier to measure aspects that you were talking about?
I think we have a sort of moral and ethical dilemma, actually. It's a really interesting question you're asking in terms of the timelines. Because when we're talking about learning of children, young people, students, a year of learning time is actually an incredibly long piece of time for that individual learner. And the younger they are, the more proportionally it is in relation to their lives, right? And so you can't repeat that year without having other implications in terms of life. So morally, we don't want to wait 3 years to work out if a particular learning intervention works, because by then that whole group of learners have been through that process. And similarly with technology, particularly in a landscape infused with AI now, everything's moving at such a pace. Again, 3-5 year studies might not even have, the same technology might not even exist in 3-5 years, 3-5 months sometimes, right? So I think we have to be a bit cautious about the timeframes we look at. But what I think we can do is think maybe less about how long something is in place over time, but think how deep can we go instead. So we might look at what's being used, how it's being used, why it's being used. And we then might look at, what happens, what's the sequence of things that are happening when that tech is being used. Technologically, yes, because that's of interest in terms of, process, procedures, all the rest of it. But what's the human experience? How do they feel when they use it? And what are the consequences of that? How does it affect human behavior? What do they do as a result? When something happens, an alert or something moves, or, they've done voice to text, whatever technological human interaction has happened, what then happens as a result? How does that affect their behaviors, learning behaviors, social behaviors, emotional behaviors, whatever it might be? And that's probably where we can do some pretty fast speed learning about how to then get the most out of that human technology interaction.
So earlier when I was saying there's kind of two directions to take this in, I want to step back to that. And the other direction I was going to go into is back to the theory for a second. And I think this is useful for even for EdTech startuppers who often do not come from a pedagogical background, pedagogical sciences background, learning sciences. They might be developers, software developers. They might have a background in economics or consulting, or in the specific subject matter expertise field of their subject matter expertise of the solution they're developing. So I think it might be interesting for even for founders and to kind of step back a second. So there's different pedagogical theories. We can talk about them. We can talk about behaviorism, social constructivism, and so forth. I guess the four main ones. Is any one better than the other?
What a great question. So these are all different theories of how learning is supported. So not the process of learning itself, the sort of science of learning, but how learning is supported. And the four different theories kind of set out in the book, traditional views, individual constructivism, social constructivism, and sociocultural, they exist in parallel. Now, to anybody looking at those or reading about those, they will probably be drawn to one of those that will feel more right than the others. And there will probably be one or more of the theories that will feel not quite right or create a sense of kind of inner friction. And it's a little bit like saying, well, we either believe the earth is flat or it's spherical. We can't kind of have a bit of both. We can't say, well, it's sort of somewhere, like a squash sphere. It's either flat or it's spherical. And theories are a way of explaining something. So you can't really pick and mix from different theories and have this, combination of different things. And I think that's why it's really important that we dig deep and we understand our own pedagogical beliefs. And that applies to everybody working in the education ecosystem, not just teachers, because they will affect the way that we see the world around us and the way that we conceptualize all of these different things. And by understanding what we believe and what we value, then we can choose the relevant approaches, methods, strategies, etc. Because if we don't do that, what happens is we lift strategies that are being promoted, often via social media, the kind of noise level, or often things that are fashionable or politically motivated or economically motivated. And then we kind of implement all these strategies in a kind of mix mash of different things, and they can often contradict each other, or, and you end up with these weird contradictions happening in classroom environments. So one of the most common is that educators will talk about wanting learners to be intrinsically motivated to learn, and we'll talk very passionately about that. And then you go into a classroom environment and you see reward cards, sticker charts, merits and sanctions, levels, class competitions, leaderboards. And those things are designed to deliver a system of extrinsic motivation. So the two are completely contradictory. Now, that's not to say one's right, the other's wrong. But if we're saying one thing, but doing something that conflicts with it, then the experience is professionally unsatisfying because what we believe won't be happening. And for those we work with, it's very, very, very confusing. And so whether somebody is a classroom educator or working as a developer or, from an economic background, it's just actually asking the question why 3 times. Why are we doing this? And then there'll be an answer. Okay, why do we think that? Okay, there'll be an answer. Why do we think that? And asking 3 levels of why. You don't need to worry about all the academic theory and the sector vocabulary, just 3 levels of depth to that why. And actually, we then just have that really, really more precise clarity that we can then, make sure that we go in the right direction with and achieve that alignment, that consistency.
Thinking of the broad range of EdTech tools that exist out there, I think my feeling is that there's certain categories of EdTech tools that might afford to deliver or instruct within whichever of the pedagogical theories, or at least the main ones. And there are other categories that instead, within due to the affordances that these tools afford, are kind of constricting to a certain pedagogical theory, or that makes sense within certain pedagogical beliefs. Is this and to kind of bring it to a tangible, a couple of tangible examples? I mean, an LMS could be utilized, I assume, for rote learning, as well as it could be utilized within, I could imagine it satisfying or being part and effectively utilized within a pedagogical conception, like social cultural conception. And as long as the tool doesn't, as long as the LMS in this case doesn't restrict certain ways of it being utilized, I think perhaps it really matters how it is utilized. But other tools perhaps might be, like we can imagine, quizzing tools or gamification tools or whatnot, more kind of tailored to a certain pedagogical theory. Is this what would you agree with this, or would you only partially agree with this?
It's a really interesting point, actually. I think you're right to demarcate the difference between systems of tools like an LMS and very specific tools, because I think that helps us kind of focus on how broad and how diverse can the usage be. Let's take the quiz tool that you mentioned, and it's one that is used a lot, isn't it, in lots of different circumstances. And I think that so quiz tools are often spoken about because they're automated, they're auto marking, they save time, they can have video, audio, symbols, images, they're really flexible in that approach. And so for the user, the learner, and for the person creating or setting them, there's a huge amount of just practical benefits, stimulus-based benefits. If we think about some of the learning and teaching strategies that underpin the use of quiz tools, they're based on things like retrieval practice, on adaptive teaching, on individualized pathways. There's a whole set of strategies that underpin why they might be helpful. And they often resonate, with practitioners really, really well. It's familiar language for them. The bit we don't necessarily think about as often, and I think this is where your line of thinking was going, is that those sorts of things are underpinned essentially by a form of individual constructivism. So learning being sequential, predefined, so you know what you're going to be learning or doing before you've even started it, and it's determined by somebody else. It's not self-directed pathways. Even if you've got a few options, someone's still decided, what those options are through algorithms or, sequences. And that, learning is individual, that it takes place in one person's head, and it might have misconceptions that need to be corrected. So, it's very different to theories around learning being socialized and learning being experiential and learning being based on communities and adoptions of practice or simple knowledge impartation. So, it is sort of underpinned by a particular theory of pedagogy. And so for a teacher or an educator who really believes that individual constructivism is the right way to support learning, then that tool is going to be far more effective than a teacher who believes something quite radically different. Flip side, throw that around the other way, you referred a moment ago to some collaborative tools. So if we take something like, a collaborative ideas board, lots of post-it notes on a wall or a shared document or whatever. And lots of people would talk about, collaboration being really, really important. And yet so often forms of collaboration like that end up being like a shared document or a shared space, but everybody kind of working in parallel on their own little bit within it. So the outcome might be collaborative, but the process is not. And the whole ethos around collaboration is that we can achieve more by working together than we can by working independently or in parallel or impartially. So the nature of interaction is the key bit, the type of talk that's happening. Now that talk can be verbally, orally, that talk can be through comments or feedback, that talk can be illustrations, annotations, it's that interaction that I do something, you give me feedback, I improve what I do and ask you then, and it's a spiral cyclical thing. So that it's not so much just the tool itself that we need to focus on, it's how that tool connects to all the other stuff going on, which might not be anything to do with digital, that makes that tool effective in the way that it was intended to be used or not. So the theory is really important because that helps us to really unpick what's this thing designed to do and why. Understanding ourselves is important, is what am I trying to do and why? And then the alignment of those two is what will make that actually happen or not.
Do you think this is more important on the consumer side? And if we're talking, of course, about K-12 EdTech, then we're talking about schools or multi-school academies or kindergartens, I guess. Is it more important? Is this kind of reasoning on the pedagogical alignment more important on their side to build their EdTech stack? Or is it also quite important on the EdTech company founder, startup founder side to think about?
Massively, massively. And I've previously held a role working for an EdTech company as head of research and development, and worked very closely with product development teams on product roadmaps and worked very closely with developers. And some of the colleagues I've enjoyed working with most are those developers who really think about what do we want that user experience to really, really be, and in real detail. And of course, that's going to make for a far more effective product, because if the visioning of the product is really, really clear on what it's trying to do, not what it's trying to sell to, not what it's trying to position itself as, but what it's actually trying to do in detail. If that clarity is there, then we can unpack from that how we're going to get there and what parts of tool development or feature development we're going to put in place to enable that to come to life. And developers are brilliant at this, really unpacking that in detail and really being specific. But we'll need that guidance of what is this actually trying to do and why. And of course, it is an investment because it requires real careful thought to be given right at the outset in terms of that product roadmap at real granular feature level as well as the bigger picture. But it's a really good investment to make, because if that alignment is in place from the product intention all the way through the features and functionality, then the user experience is going to be really clear and really on point. And then the sales, marketing, the implementation of that, so much easier because the story is already there, the direction of travel is already there. And of course, if you've got clear intentions and you've got the features and functionality that support those intentions, then the sort of rollout and the monitoring, the evaluation, and therefore the impact is going to be very, very straightforward to have a look at. So, it does require a bit more time and energy at the outset, but longer term is really going to pay off, not just economically for the EdTech supply themselves, but for that end user and that broader education ecosystem. And actually, morally and ethically, that's what we want to be doing, isn't it? Everyone aligning for those shared intentions.
And hopefully we can get the market incentives aligned so that market incentives also bring to this or bring this about. I previously interviewed Michael Forshaw from EdTech Impact, and I was wondering whether you could give us kind of a spoiler of your collaboration with EdTech Impact.
So it's Michael is doing some absolutely brilliant work leading EdTech Impact, really, really brilliant work, because it's just enabling end users to really look at what their options are and to filter down from a very, very noisy marketplace to what they're really looking for and why they're looking for it. And he's bringing greater precision, over time to that landscape, to that space, to enable buying decisions and implementations decisions to be made from a more informed basis. And so what we're starting to explore is when products have these intentions and we can see the evidence and we can see the reviews and we can see the feedback of those intentions sort of coming to life through usage. How might they marry up with the intentions of teachers, of leaders, of those who are going to be making those purchasing and implementation decisions? So we can kind of bring this fusion together. And it's a really exciting place to explore. Early days, but really exciting place to explore.
Yeah, and I think this is very worthwhile work for the field as a whole. And I before knowing about your collaboration, I could kind of picture how your contribution to the field and the work of EdTech Impact could come together. So to kind of wrap this up, I would like to share the public reports that can be found on your website. The one that I've enjoyed very much reading for Leo Academy Trust, as well as Purple Mash. I think I found these reports to kind of crystallize and be able to crystallize many of the things that we've mentioned today, how you've applied them into helping, for example, the Academy Trust understand their EdTech choices. And I'm very grateful for you being with me today to discuss the work you do. Of course, I very much recommend From EdTech to PedTech as a book to inform the link that is sometimes not sufficiently strong, I guess, between EdTech industry and pedagogical theory. And I think you're doing wonderful work in trying to strengthen this link.
That's very kind of you. We're all sharing this journey together, and the more we can kind of draw together and then share that journey effectively, the better for everybody. So thank you very much for your very warm welcome.